Joining us now is author, journalist, commentator, and author of the really excellent new book, The Upstairs Wife, An Intimate History of Pakistan, Rafia Zakaria. Rafia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So, Rafia, to start by situating this book. We've talked, I've had you on this program and actually a program I used to do for Aslan Media before, and you're someone who just really does, in my view, a kind of singular job of teasing apart a lot of the intricacies and a lot of the subtleties of a lot of things that sort of get spoken about in really sloppy generalizations, basically. Islam, feminism, foreign policy, balancing all of these different elements. And you are sort of giving the country of Pakistan that treatment really through telling your own story in a way. So, situate this book for us. Explain the time that you came of age in Pakistan and how this story, this narrative, holds a frame for everything else that we're trying to understand about this country and all of the issues that it represents.
Well, thank you so much, Michael. As you know, as you pointed out, I've been a columnist for Dawn, which is Pakistan's largest newspaper, for several years now. And every week I focus on stories facing Pakistani women and their perspectives on, as the world knows, the growing extremism in Pakistan, the crackdown on women in public space. So, in keeping with that, this book is essentially my attempt to reclaim the story of Pakistan for its women. So it's the story of Karachi, which is the city where I was born and raised, and which is now probably, I think, the biggest Muslim city in the world at 18, 19 million. And tell it through the stories of both women in my family that I knew and love, and then also the women in politics, whether it's Benazir Bhutto, who was a fixture in the political life of the country, and also lesser known women like Shahida Parveen, who was one of the women who was sentenced to be stoned to death under the Hudud ordinances. So the book essentially weaves together all of these stories to present to people the emotional landscape of the country. And as you well know, in probably covering Pakistan for your show, this is a dimension of Pakistan that is very much left out of the general narrative. It's a security, terror, nukes dominated story. And this book is my attempt to dislodge that perception.
Yeah, and I would add to that, it's a security, nukes, terror presentation, and then the extent to which women's issues are brought up, and even that phrase, women's issues, we could probably find a way to put that a lot better. But barring that for now, even the way those issues of the human rights of women are brought up, it's usually in the context of sort of an umbrella to justify really problematic policies connected with security and terrorism. So that's another way in which we have to be really conscious about that rhetoric in the West, and that's something you point out very well and very frequently. Going back for a moment, you mentioned the Hudud ordinances. I want you to explain what those are, and then we'll build out from a portrait of someone in your family that sort of exemplifies this. And then I think it's important for us to get to the personality and the legacy of Benazir Bhutto, because everything that we're talking about is really sort of exemplified in her in a certain way for good and for ills. But let's start with the Hudud ordinances and move from there.
Well, the Hudud ordinances were passed in 1979 by then military dictator General Ziaul Haq. And essentially, they were an attempt by the Pakistani state to control intimate life because they they were laws that would prosecute and that do prosecute adultery and fornication, and that left particularly women in a very vulnerable position because if they faced an accusation of zina, or which is adultery or fornication, they could be, be flogged and imprisoned. And a lot of Pakistani women are in prison or have been imprisoned under that. But the most pernicious aspect of it is, of course, that once these laws were passed, the consequence was that if a woman in Pakistan was raped and she chose to file a case or charges against her rapist, she would have to produce 4 adult male witnesses to the act. And if she wasn't able to do that, she was liable for an adultery or a fornication prosecution. So the rape survivor would be, can be, even under existing Pakistani law, prosecuted because she, just the fact that she was alleging rape was then considered a confession of having had sex outside a marital relationship.
Right.
So, the way I bring those threads together, I mean, the central story of the book is about my aunt, and she did not run into the hudud or zina laws, but she did run into the fact that she couldn't bear children, and so her husband decided to take a second wife. And what I tease out is essentially the collective anguish of these laws, whether they're laws restricting women's autonomy in marriage or laws restricting women's sexual autonomy. They impose severe constraints on women's lives. But at the same time, the sort of irony and contradiction of all of it is that even while we've had women in leadership, we haven't been able to change those laws in Pakistan. So unraveling the complexity of that, of the fact that even when Benazir Bhutto, who I describe as the freest woman I knew growing up in Pakistan, and this would be true for a lot of girls like me who are growing up in Pakistan, is, I wanted very much for her to take a stand against these constraints, whether it was against arranged marriage or marriage in general, or the fact that these laws existed on the books even when our prime minister was a woman. And that's what the journey I sort of take readers through, is understanding how those complexities are interwoven into the Pakistani context, and how it's crucial to understand them if we're going to try to understand the challenges that Pakistani women or Muslim women face today.
Absolutely, and you do a really, really good job of that. I want to get more to Benazir Bhutto and those complexities, but briefly, I want to ask, when we talk about specifically Zalhuk and the Hudud laws, just sort of tracing different histories of different versions of Sharia as an example. Sharia is a term that gets thrown around by a lot of people, whether obviously, there's the sort of extreme of, conspiracy theorists somewhere saying, oh my God, like Sharia is going to get implemented or something. But even people who might kind of pass off as more quote unquote sophisticated commentators, they'll wave around polls about, this many British Muslims think, Sharia, is what they want, and that's a big problem. That's a big threat. Obviously, Sharia encompasses many different things, many different traditions, some of which are definitely very problematic, and I guess, but some of which also might implicate, as an example, a perception that Islamic finance is more just or less corrupt, and that might be a version that people are responding to as just one example. But specifically in Pakistan and the laws that Zalhuk implemented, would you say that those were out of keeping with, for lack of a better word, kind of Pakistani Islam, or the Islam that was more prevalent in South Asia and maybe potentially more having to do with his alliance with Saudi Arabia and kind of importing a particular brand that's much harsher, specifically Saudi? Or was it a more kind of organic expression, or all of the above?
Well, I mean, it's that is precisely the question that underlies the book. I
Hmm.
don't think it's only Westerners that are confused about what Sharia means and how, the how law as Islamic law as a single entity can be implemented, whether it's in legislation or it's in personal life.
Hmm.
And what I try to do in the book is to take readers into a marriage and into personal life and see how, these very literal interpretation of the Quran, which says you can take more than one wife and that you have to do perfect justice between those wives. So I take them into this relationship so that they can see how the enactment of this perfect justice within a marriage amounts to a tremendous amount of emotional violence
Okay.
and ruthlessness. Because I think those dimensions of rules, or laws, whether it's Sharia or any other law, rarely get explored. But those questions are central to Pakistan right now. I mean, the reason why Pakistan is so mired in conflict is because this question of what Sharia really is, or how you can implement Sharia, whether it's in sexual relationships, with the Zina and Hudud ordinance, or whether it's in marital relationships with the permission for polygamy, is a very complex question, and people have different answers to it. The point of presenting this relationship is so readers can evaluate that for themselves, whether they're Pakistani or they're American. Is that this disjunct between what is imagined to be a pure or just or perfectly Muslim society, and then the realities of people's lives and their emotions are often in contradiction.
Okay.
Um, and so the vision of the world that we have is one that has to be mediated by uh, empathy and by compassion and by sort of understanding those dimensions of marriage as well. That at least is, I've tried very hard to interweave the political context with the personal one because ultimately I think to understand these questions or to understand the conundrums Pakistanis face, you have to put yourself in the shoes of someone who is Pakistani. And I think that's what I'm trying to do with Upstairs Wife.
That's definitely what you're doing, in my view, and I think yes, the role of empathy in your work allows you to both, on one hand, actually point to a much more kind of rigorous look at what are the systemic and institutional factors that drive these things we're trying to figure out, whether it's terrorism or security arrangements or arms control, all of those issues that get emphasized a lot. But what's the actual context that are driving it? And then on the other hand, through a much more authentic engagement with actual human beings, their narratives, their lived experiences, you're able to get to a much, much bigger and more grounded way of looking at what is really driving the political landscape and the emotional landscape. And that's again, that's one of the things I find really important about your work. Now, going to Benazir Bhutto, it's really interesting. Yes, you describe her as the freest woman that you sort of knew and saw growing up. And I think Benazir Bhutto, you know, there's the reality of her record, which I want you to get to, good and bad. Then there's also what she represented in Pakistan. I think she represented something very clear in the West, which is in the sense that until, there was a certain point where her sort of image soured, and there was a lot of reports in places like the New York Times on, particularly her husband actually, and corruption and this and that. But there was also a certain impulse within certainly the American, but more broadly Western foreign policy establishment that just her as this kind of charismatic individual could bypass all of the other variables in Pakistan. Like, oh, well, we got Benazir there, and she went to Harvard. I think she also went to Oxford. She's very sophisticated. She knows how to speak, the language of Davos, and she's the prime minister, so we're good to go. And of course, that wasn't the case. And in some ways, those policies actually aided areas where her governance was really problematic. But I just want your take on her personality and her presence and that legacy, because that does seem like it embodies so many of the things you're talking about.
Indeed. I mean, the book opens on the day of Benazir's assassination, and this question that I was struggling with on whether this represents an end moment of some sort for Pakistani women.
Hmm.
Her figure was a very strong one in my life growing up, not because I didn't know her personally and never met her, but she was everywhere on TV, in the newspapers. Very obviously a very, very public and controversial figure in Pakistan. But the moment that I describe in the book, in the exploration of it, is that the one that most resounded with me was watching Benazir Bhutto get married, because that was broadcast live on Pakistani TV in Karachi when I was a young girl growing up. And here was this woman who I expected, because she was defying so many other norms, to kind of defy that traditional role of wife and mother. So, I was being raised to also ascribe and fit into those roles. So I wanted very much for her to be an example that I could say, okay, well, she's not living the typical life of marriage and kids. So if you have that expectation, I wasn't quite so conscious of it, obviously, as a young girl, but that's what I wanted from her. I wanted to be able to say to my mother or my grandmothers that, not every Pakistani woman just gets married and has kids. So when you have that as a backdrop and you see this visual of Benazir Bhutto getting married, and she's marrying this, man from a feudal family,
Right.
and it's an arranged marriage and all of that. In some ways, in that childish sense, your heart sinks, because here is, like you said, I call her the freest woman we knew, also ascribing to a gender role that everybody else has to ascribe to, and in a way that represented kind of, there's no exit here.
Mm.
And of course, later on, I do unravel her politics as well, and the compromises she had to make, and there are parallels between that and those sort of political compromises, and perhaps, the compromises that women have to make in marriages and in intimate relationships, and the ones that my aunt had to make.
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. It's just the parallels are really, they're very, very revealing. But before we finish up this conversation, I was just hoping we could touch on something else that's happening in Pakistan right now, which is in response. And again, it's a very, very interesting thing the way this plays out in the West, in response to the terrorist attack on the children at the military school several months ago, which really was a sort of, at least in the way it was presented, and it obviously literally was just a sort of particularly horrifying event. And the Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif announced this sort of new strong push against the Pakistani Taliban and implementing military courts and all of this other sort of new moves against terrorism. And now in Pakistan, there is a civil society movement which is moving. It seems, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like there's two components of it, which is that there's a question around things like, is the answer to dealing with the terrorist crisis by empowering some of the elements in Pakistani politics and power structure that help facilitate these groups growing to begin with? And secondly, there's specific groups in Pakistan that are also terrorist groups that are explicitly not being targeted by the Sharif government. And I'm just wondering if you could just touch on this and give us a sense of what's going on.
Well, you're absolutely right. Is that since the Peshawar attack, the civil society in Pakistan has tried very hard to mobilize against some of these extremist groups that they perceive and correctly perceive as having getting some shelter from government authorities. So whether it's the current protest that's asking, for the arrest of the leader of ASWJ, or a few weeks earlier, there was another similar protest in which the head of the Red Mosque in Islamabad refused to condemn the killers of the Peshawar attack.
Right.
And he went, he publicly refused to do that. And that's kind of was the genesis of this civil society movement. And they've been pressing for his arrest and saying that, the government can't just say we're cracking down on terror. We want to see that. They did ultimately get charges filed against him, against this other cleric in that case, but they have, he's still to be arrested. The police has not arrested him, and so it's a similar situation right now with this ongoing protest, is because people are saying, you say you condemn terrorism, then why are these people going free? We've gone and established military courts, and the government says again and again that it's a black and white issue. They're not going to pick and choose the terrorists. They're going to prosecute. So we're going to hold the government accountable to that. And I'm really glad that you're bringing out this story, because it's these stories, as you know, that get completely sidelined.
Right.
No one wants to talk about when ordinary Pakistanis are out there in the protest, saying, out on the streets in a very dangerous country right now, and asking for this. I mean, in the last protest, I know of a woman. She was the only woman who participated in the protest, and she, was beaten up by some of the thugs from this, who are supporters of extremism. And despite that, she was out there. So we've got these stories of heroism and bravery in Pakistan, and but it's an uphill battle to get people to engage with them and to get a deeper understanding of the country beyond, are the nukes safe, or, the most dangerous place in the world sort of narrative.
Right, and also it's the most interesting story, because you're having this massive group of people that are taking on the government, as well as genuinely really dangerous terrorist organizations. And this conversation that we either got to back some mediocre autocrat, or just so we can have passage to run drone attacks that are going to kill a lot of civilians, or the other option is it's just run by terrorists, is both incredibly problematic. It's also dull and stupid. And I just would like to mention Gibran Nasir, who was involved in these organizings, and I was actually in touch with him a little over a week ago, shortly before he was arrested. And Rafia, I think the work you do is essential to what you're talking about. So I just really, really appreciate your time. The book is The Upstairs Wife: An Intimate History of Pakistan, and you can let the hotel know that they can run their fire drill now.
Yes, I will. And,
Yeah.
just a shout out to independent bookstores. They are promoting the book. It's the February pick of the month for, the Indie Best selection. And
Great.
so if anyone wants it, they should go out to the independent bookstore in their neighborhood and get The Upstairs Wife from there. So,
And there is a
I'd
link to it
appreciate
on our
that.
website if you don't want to support independent bookstores and buy it through Amazon, but it is through our link, so you will give us a slight kickback. But yes, buy independent book through independent bookstores. It's a great book. Rafia, thank you so much for your time.